The clock on the wall showed 11:45 p.m. as I walked through the empty lobby of the old office building. The eerie silence was broken only by the echo of my footsteps on the polished marble floor. I had been working late again, something that had become increasingly common in recent weeks. My office, located on the 27th floor, was in one of those grand, mid-century skyscrapers that had seen better days. The building was mostly deserted by this time of night, with only a handful of other late-night workers scattered throughout its many floors. I approached the bank of elevators and pressed the call button, the soft ding of the arriving car breaking the silence. The elevator doors slid open with a quiet hiss, revealing an empty car. The fluorescent lights inside flickered slightly, casting long shadows on the walls. I stepped inside, feeling a faint chill in the air as the doors closed behind me with a heavy thud. I had ridden this elevator countless times over the years, but tonight something felt different. The air was thick with an unsettling stillness, the kind that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand on end. I pressed the button for the 27th floor and leaned back against the wall, waiting for the familiar lurch as the elevator began its ascent. The building was quiet, too quiet. At this hour, the usual hum of office equipment, the distant murmur of voices, and the occasional ringing of a phone were all absent. My name is Jane. I'm 34 years old, a project manager at one of the city's top advertising firms. The job had been my dream since I first entered the workforce, and for years I had dedicated myself to climbing the corporate ladder. I had become known for my ability to handle the most demanding clients and the tightest deadlines, but it came at a cost. The long hours, the late nights, and the constant pressure were starting to take their toll. I was often the last one to leave the office, as was the case tonight. The building, once a beacon of modern architecture, now felt like a relic of a bygone era. It had been built in the 1960s, during a time when the city was booming, and this skyscraper had stood as a symbol of progress and innovation. But as the decades passed, newer, shinier buildings had sprung up around it, and the old tower had been largely forgotten. Many of the floors were now vacant, the offices abandoned as businesses relocated to more modern facilities. Despite this, our firm had remained, clinging to its prime location in the heart of downtown. The firm was my life. I had no family in the city, and my social life had dwindled to the occasional dinner with a colleague. My apartment, a small but comfortable one-bedroom on the outskirts of town, often felt more like a hotel room than a home. The nights were the worst, the hours dragging on as I lay awake, my mind racing with thoughts of work and the nagging sense that something was missing from my life. It wasn't always like this. I had once been full of ambition and drive, eager to prove myself in the fast-paced world of advertising. But lately I had begun to feel a creeping sense of unease, a gnawing doubt that all my hard work had been for nothing. The endless cycle of meetings, presentations, and deadlines had become a blur, each day blending into the next. The only time I felt any real emotion was in those quiet moments late at night when the office was empty, and I was alone with my thoughts. As the elevator began its slow climb, I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, trying to shake off the sense of dread that had been building in the pit of my stomach. The gentle hum of the machinery was oddly soothing, a constant rhythm that helped me relax, if only for a moment. But then, without warning, the elevator jerked to a sudden stop. My eyes snapped open, and I instinctively reached out to steady myself against the wall. The lights flickered again, more violently this time, before plunging the car into darkness. My heart leaped into my throat as I stood frozen in place, my breath coming in shallow gasps. For a few agonizing seconds, the only sound was the pounding of my heart in my ears. I fumbled for my phone, desperate for some source of light, but as I pulled it from my bag, the screen remained dark. Dead. I cursed under my breath, the panic rising as I realized I was trapped in complete darkness. "Okay, stay calm," I whispered to myself, my voice trembling. "It's just a power outage. It'll come back on in a minute." I tried to steady my breathing, forcing myself to think logically. The building was old, and power outages weren't uncommon, especially this late at night when the electrical systems were taxed by the few remaining offices. The emergency lights would kick in soon, and the elevator would start moving again. I just had to be patient. But as the seconds ticked by, the darkness pressed in on me, and the silence became suffocating. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead, my hands trembling as I clutched my dead phone like a lifeline. The thought of being trapped in this tiny, enclosed space was terrifying. I had never been claustrophobic, but the combination of darkness and isolation was more than I could handle. Then, faintly at first, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, coming from somewhere within the elevator. I strained to listen, holding my breath as the sound grew louder, more insistent. It was as if someone or something was tapping on the walls, just beyond my reach. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing in the confined space. "Is someone there?" There was no response, only the steady tapping, now louder and more deliberate. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end as the noise seemed to move closer, shifting from one side of the elevator to the other. My mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Was it another passenger trapped in the darkness with me? Or was it something else, something far more sinister? I pressed myself against the wall, my heart hammering in my chest. The tapping grew louder, almost frantic, as if whatever was making the noise was trying to get inside the elevator. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that it would stop, that the lights would come back on, and this nightmare would end. But the tapping continued, relentless and unyielding. I could feel the vibrations through the metal walls, the sound reverberating in my bones. Then, without warning, it stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, and I dared to open my eyes, squinting into the darkness. And that's when I saw it. A faint outline, barely visible in the pitch blackness, standing in the far corner of the elevator. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. It was a shadow darker than the surrounding darkness, with no discernible features. But I could feel its presence, a cold, malevolent energy that filled the small space with an overwhelming sense of dread. The shadow didn't move, but I knew it was aware of me. I could feel its gaze, its eyes boring into me, even though I couldn't see them. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this thing as possible, but there was nowhere to go. I was trapped, and it was coming for me. The air in the elevator grew colder, and I felt a chill run down my spine as the shadow began to move slowly, deliberately towards me. I backed up against the wall, my hands trembling as I fumbled for the emergency call button. My fingers found it, and I pressed down with all my might, praying for a response. "Please help me," I cried, my voice shaking with terror. "There's something in here with me." But there was no response, only static. The line was dead, just like my phone. I was completely alone, with no way to call for help. The shadow was closer now, mere inches away from me. I could feel its presence, a cold, suffocating pressure that made it hard to breathe. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing myself for whatever was about to happen. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the lights flickered back on. I gasped, blinking against the sudden brightness, my heart still pounding in my chest. The elevator was empty. The shadow was gone, vanished without a trace. I looked around in disbelief, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. The elevator jerked back to life, and I felt a wave of relief as it resumed its ascent. I was safe for now. But the memory of that shadow, that unseen presence, would stay with me forever. When the elevator finally reached the 27th floor, I stumbled out, my legs weak and shaky. I could barely focus as I made my way to my office, my mind replaying the events in the elevator over and over again. I was in a daze, my thoughts jumbled and incoherent. The logical part of my brain tried to dismiss it as a hallucination, a trick of the mind brought on by stress and fatigue. But deep down, I knew what I had seen was real. I didn't stay in the office long that night. I gathered my things and left as quickly as I could, taking the stairs instead of the elevator. Each step echoed in the empty stairwell, a stark reminder of the silence that had filled the elevator. As I drove home, the events of the night played over and over in my mind, like a broken record. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in my chest. The shadow, that malevolent presence, had left its mark on me, a dark memory that I couldn't erase. In the days that followed, I found myself avoiding the elevator at all costs. I would take the stairs, even if it meant climbing 27 flights, just to avoid being alone in that confined space. My coworkers noticed the change in me, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them what had happened. They wouldn't understand. How could they? I barely understood it myself. Sleep became elusive, and when I did manage to drift off, I was plagued by nightmares. In my dreams, I was back in the elevator, trapped in the darkness, with the shadow closing in on me. Each time I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, my mind filled with terror. The fear followed me everywhere, a constant companion that I couldn't shake. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings, always looking over my shoulder, always expecting the shadow to appear. My work began to suffer, my once sharp focus dulled by the constant anxiety that gnawed at me. I tried to convince myself that it was just a one-time occurrence, that I had imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The shadow was real, and it had left its mark on me. The building, once a symbol of progress and innovation, had become a place of fear and darkness, a place where the shadows came to life. I eventually left my job at the firm, unable to continue working in that building. I moved to a new city, started a new job, and tried to put the past behind me. But the memory of that night in the elevator never left me. It lingered in the back of my mind. Even now, years later, I still feel its presence sometimes, in the quiet moments when I'm alone. A faint tapping, a flicker of shadow in the corner of my eye, a chill in the air. And I know without a doubt that the shadow is still out there, waiting in the darkness, biding its time. The world is full of mysteries and terrors that we can't begin to understand. We go about our lives, secure in our routines, unaware of the shadows that lurk just beyond our sight. But every now and then, those shadows step into the light, reminding us that the line between reality and nightmare is thinner than we think. And all it takes is one ride in an elevator, one moment of darkness, to realize that the shadows are always watching, always waiting, and they can find us wherever we go. My day started just like any other. The alarm clock buzzed at 5:30 a.m., its shrill sound pulling me from a restless sleep. I groaned, slapping my hand down to silence the noise, and rolled out of bed. The morning routine was mechanical at this point: shower, dress in my uniform, grab a cup of coffee, and head out the door. The winter chill bit at my face as I stepped onto the street, pulling my jacket tighter around me. The streets were still quiet, the city not yet fully awake, as I made my way to the subway station. I work as a janitor in one of the big office buildings downtown. It's not glamorous work, but it's steady, and it pays the bills. The building itself is an impressive structure, towering over the city with its sleek glass exterior and modern design. It houses some of the most prestigious law firms and tech companies in the area, and it's my job to keep the place clean and presentable. I've been working there for almost 10 years now, and I know the place inside and out, every corner, every hallway, every room. When I arrived at work that morning, I greeted the security guard at the front desk with a nod. He waved back, barely looking up from his newspaper. The lobby was quiet, as it always was at this time of day. The early morning hours were my favorite. The building was still and peaceful before the rush of workers filled its halls. I made my way to the janitor's closet, stashed my bag in the small locker, and grabbed my supplies for the day. My tasks were straightforward. Clean the offices, take out the trash, mop the floors. The same routine I'd been doing for years. It was monotonous work, but there was a certain comfort in the routine. I didn't have to think much, just go through the motions, and the day would pass by quickly enough. My name is Michael. I'm 46 years old, a man of simple means and simpler pleasures. I've lived in this city my whole life, born and raised in a small apartment not far from where I work now. My mother was a nurse, and my father was a factory worker, both hard-working people who instilled in me the importance of a good, honest job. When I was younger, I had bigger dreams, maybe becoming an electrician or starting my own handyman business. But life had a way of pushing those dreams aside. After high school, I took whatever jobs I could find, and eventually I landed this janitorial position. It wasn't what I had imagined for myself, but it was steady work, and over time I came to accept it. I never married, never had kids. There were a few relationships over the years, but nothing that lasted. I guess I was too focused on making a living to worry about settling down. Now at my age, I'm used to being on my own. My small apartment is quiet, filled with the few things I've collected over the years, books, a few old records, and a TV that's probably older than I am. Work is my life, and the people in the building have become a sort of extended family to me, even if we don't know each other all that well. There's the receptionist on the 15th floor who always smiles when she sees me, the accountant on the 20th who likes to chat about the weather, and the young lawyer on the 8th who leaves me a cup of coffee every now and then. It's a lonely job in some ways, but it's a quiet life, and I've made peace with that. It was around 7:30 a.m. when I stepped into the elevator to head up to the 23rd floor. I had just finished cleaning the lobby and was on my way to start my rounds on the upper levels. The building was starting to come alive by then, with a few early risers trickling in to begin their workday. I pressed the button for the 23rd floor and leaned back against the wall, my mind already drifting to the tasks ahead. As the doors were about to close, a hand shot out, stopping them. I looked up, startled, as a man stepped into the elevator. He was tall, maybe in his mid-30s, with a bony face and empty eyes. His dark hair was unkempt, and his clothes looked wrinkled and disheveled, as if he had slept in them. There was something off about him, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. "Sorry," he muttered, avoiding eye contact as he pressed the button for the 16th floor. "No problem," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. The doors closed and the elevator began its smooth ascent. The man stood in the corner, his head down, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his coat. There was a tension in the air, an uncomfortable silence that filled the small space. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the numbers lighting up above the door as we passed each floor. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The man was too still, too quiet, and the way he kept his head down made me uneasy. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye, trying to get a better look without being too obvious. His face was pale, almost sickly, and there was a slight tremor in his hands. I felt a knot forming in my stomach, a sense of unease that was growing with each passing second. The elevator ride seemed to stretch on forever, each floor passing in slow motion. The man's presence was unnerving, his silence heavy and oppressive. I tried to tell myself that it was just my imagination, that I was overreacting. But the feeling of dread was creeping up my spine, making the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Out of the blue, the man began to hum, a low, tuneless sound that sent chills through me. It was barely audible at first, just a faint murmur that I might have ignored if not for the eerie quality of it. But as the seconds ticked by, the humming grew louder, more insistent, filling the small space with its unsettling melody. I shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to do. Should I say something? Ask if he was okay? The words were on the tip of my tongue, but something held me back. There was a look in his eyes, a vacant, distant stare that made me feel like he wasn't entirely there, like he was lost in some dark place inside his mind. The humming stopped suddenly, and the man turned to look at me, his gaze locking onto mine. There was something in his eyes, something cold and empty, like he was looking right through me. I felt a jolt of fear, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to hold his stare. But it was too much, and I quickly looked away, my hands gripping the railing behind me. "Do you ever think about it?" he asked, his voice low and raspy. I blinked, caught off guard by the question. Think about what I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. About what it would be like, he continued, his eyes still fixed on me. To be trapped, to be alone, to know that no one's coming to save you. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead, my mind racing to process what he was saying. There was something menacing in his tone, something that sent a wave of panic through me. I glanced at the numbers above the door, willing the elevator to move faster, to reach the 16th floor so this man could get out. But the elevator seemed to be crawling, each second dragging on like an eternity. The man took a step closer to me, his movements slow and deliberate. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating, as if the walls of the elevator were closing in around us. "You never know when it's going to happen," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper now. "One moment you're fine, and the next everything changes. Just like that." He snapped his fingers, the sound echoing in the confined space. I flinched, my heart racing as I tried to stay calm. But the fear was overwhelming, a rising tide that threatened to drown me. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice shaking. The man smiled, a thin, twisted smile that sent a shiver down my spine. "You'll see," he said, his eyes glinting with something dark and dangerous. "You'll see." The elevator jerked to a sudden stop, the lights flickering before plunging us into darkness. My breath caught in my throat as I stood frozen in place, the darkness pressing in on me from all sides. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own breathing, shallow and rapid. I reached out, fumbling for the emergency button, my hands shaking as I tried to find it in the darkness. But before I could press it, the man spoke again, his voice a soft whisper that seemed to come from all around me. "Don't bother," he said. "It won't help." Panic surged through me, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do you mean? What's going on?" There was a long pause, the silence stretching out uncomfortably before he spoke again. "This is where it starts," he said, his voice barely audible. "This is where everything changes." I couldn't see him in the darkness, but I could feel him there, close to me, too close. The fear was overwhelming now, a cold, suffocating wave that threatened to consume me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, trying to find a way out. The lights flickered back on, dim and flickering, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The man was standing right in front of me, his face inches from mine, his eyes dark and empty. I gasped, stumbling back against the wall, my heart racing as I tried to put some distance between us. But there was nowhere to go. The elevator was too small, too confined, and the man was blocking the door. I could feel the walls closing in on me, the air growing thick and heavy, suffocating me. My mind was screaming at me to run, to get away, but there was nowhere to go. The man reached out, his hand brushing against my arm, and I flinched, recoiling from his touch. His smile widened, a twisted, malevolent grin that sent a wave of terror through me. "You're trapped," he whispered, his voice soft and menacing, just like the others. I felt a cold chill run down my spine, the realization hitting me like a punch to the gut. He wasn't just some random stranger. He was dangerous, and I was trapped in this elevator with him, with no way out. The fear was paralyzing, a cold, suffocating wave that left me trembling and helpless. I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't breathe. All I could do was stare at him, my mind racing, my heart pounding, as the terror took hold. The darkness in that elevator wasn't just in the flickering lights or the narrow confines of the space. It was deeper, more profound, an all-encompassing dread that swallowed me whole. Being trapped in that elevator, with a stranger who was anything but ordinary, stripped away every sense of security I had. The mundane ride in a familiar building became a waking nightmare, and I realized just how fragile the line between safety and horror truly is. I've often heard people say that elevators make them feel uneasy. There's something inherently unsettling about being suspended in a small metal box, high above the ground, with nothing but cables holding you up. But before that night, I'd never thought much of it. To me, elevators were just a convenient way to get from one floor to another, nothing more. Now, every time I see an elevator, I'm reminded of that night. The memory is burned into my mind, a constant reminder of how vulnerable we are in those moments. We step into these confined spaces, trusting that they'll carry us safely to our destination, never considering the possibility that something could go wrong. But all it takes is one moment, one malfunction, one wrong turn, one encounter with someone you shouldn't be trapped with, and everything changes. The walls close in, the air grows thick, and the terror takes hold. Since that night, I've found myself avoiding elevators whenever possible. I'll take the stairs, even if it means an extra 20 minutes of walking. I can't stand the thought of being trapped in that small space again, with no way out, no escape from the fear. And the worst part, the man who was in that elevator with me, he's still out there somewhere. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I know that our paths crossed in that small, confined space, and I'll never forget the look in his eyes, the way his voice sounded when he whispered those final words. "You're trapped, just like the others." I never found out what he meant by that, who the others were or what had happened to them. But I know that I'll never forget that night, and I'll never step into an elevator without feeling that same cold, suffocating fear. In the end, we're all just one elevator ride away from something that could change our lives forever. And sometimes the scariest part isn't what happens. It's the thought that it could happen again, at any time, in any place, with anyone. It was just another typical Friday evening, the kind where everyone in the office is itching to escape the confines of their cubicles and head home to start the weekend. The clock had just ticked past 6, and the usual exodus had begun, with employees filtering out of the building in 2s and 3s. I was among them, blending into the steady stream of tired faces and half-hearted small talk as we made our way to the elevators. The building I worked in was an unremarkable 20-story office tower in downtown Chicago, a place I had become so familiar with that I could navigate it with my eyes closed. The elevators were ancient, one of those rickety old models with polished brass fixtures and creaky doors that took a few extra seconds to close. I'd ridden them countless times over the years, never once considering that something could go wrong. After all, elevators are designed to be safe, reliable, and above all, routine. They're supposed to be the least of your worries. I squeezed into the elevator with about 6 other people, a mix of my co-workers and a few unfamiliar faces from other offices in the building. We were all packed in, shoulder to shoulder, breathing the stale, slightly musty air that always seemed to cling to the inside of that metal box. Someone pressed the button for the lobby, and the doors slid shut with their usual groan. The hum of the elevator's motor kicked in, and we began our descent. At first, everything was as ordinary as it could be. The usual polite nods and half smiles, the soft chiming of someone's phone as they checked their messages, and the faint buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. I leaned back against the wall, my mind already drifting to what I'd do when I got home. Maybe order some takeout, crack open a beer, and catch up on that TV show I'd been meaning to finish. It was the end of a long week, and I was more than ready to relax. But then, something unexpected happened. As we reached the 17th floor, the elevator shuddered, a brief, violent jolt that sent a ripple of unease through the small crowd. The lights flickered, just for a moment, but it was enough to make everyone glance around nervously. A few uneasy chuckles broke the silence, and someone muttered, "Old building," right, the kind of forced humor people use to brush off the uncomfortable feeling that something isn't quite right. The elevator continued its descent, but there was a noticeable change. The smooth, almost imperceptible movement had become jerky, uneven, as if the machinery was struggling to keep the cabin steady. I could feel the tension growing in the small space, an undercurrent of anxiety that none of us wanted to acknowledge just yet. It wasn't until we passed the 15th floor that the situation escalated. Without warning, the elevator lurched violently, as if it had hit something in the shaft. The force was strong enough to knock us off balance, causing a few people to stumble into each other. The lights flickered again, more persistently this time, casting our faces in a harsh, strobe-like glow. There was a collective gasp, followed by a moment of stunned silence. That's when the elevator began to descend much faster than it should have. I hadn't always worked in an office. My name's Mark Jennings, and I'm a 36-year-old IT specialist, a job that doesn't exactly scream excitement or adventure. It wasn't what I had envisioned for myself when I was younger, but life has a funny way of steering you down paths you never expected. I grew up in a small town in Indiana, the kind of place where everyone knows each other and nothing much ever changes. My parents were good, honest folks. My dad worked at the local factory and Mom was a school teacher. We didn't have much, but we made do. I was always the quiet, bookish type, more interested in computers and gadgets than sports or socializing. I had a small group of friends who shared my interests, and we spent most of our free time tinkering with old computers, trying to code simple games, and dreaming of making it big in the tech world one day. After high school, I moved to Chicago for college, eager to escape the small-town life and make something of myself. I studied computer science, worked hard, and eventually landed a decent job in the city's tech industry. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and I found a certain satisfaction in solving problems and making things work. Over the years, I moved from job to job, always looking for the next opportunity, the next step up the ladder. The current job I had was nothing special, a mid-level position at a marketing firm that took up 3 floors in the office building. It was a stable gig, not too stressful, and it allowed me to afford a small apartment in a decent neighborhood. My days were filled with troubleshooting network issues, setting up workstations, and making sure everything ran smoothly for the company's employees. It wasn't exactly what I had dreamed of when I first got into computers, but it was a comfortable life. My personal life was quiet, maybe too quiet. I had a few close friends, but no one I saw regularly. Relationships had come and gone over the years, none of them lasting more than a few months. I wasn't the kind of guy who found it easy to connect with people on a deeper level. Maybe it was because I spent so much time in my own head, more comfortable with machines and code than with emotions and small talk. That Friday evening, as I stood in that elevator with my coworkers and a few strangers, I was thinking about how I'd spend my weekend. I had no big plans, just the usual routine of catching up on sleep, maybe playing some video games, and avoiding the outside world as much as possible. I liked my solitude. It was a chance to recharge after a week of dealing with people and their endless demands. But as the elevator started to act up, those thoughts were quickly replaced by something else, something much darker. The moment the elevator began to speed up, I knew something was seriously wrong. Elevators aren't supposed to move like that, especially not one as old as this. It felt as if the machinery had gone haywire, sending us plummeting down the shaft at a rate far faster than normal. The smooth hum of the motor was replaced by a loud, grinding noise that filled the cabin, making my ears ring. People started to panic. The nervous chatter that had filled the space just moments before was replaced by shouts of alarm and frantic whispers. I could see the fear in everyone's eyes, the sudden realization that we were no longer in control of the situation. Some of them grabbed onto the handrails, while others pressed themselves against the walls, as if trying to brace for impact. I could feel my own heart pounding in my chest, the adrenaline surging through my veins as the elevator continued its rapid descent. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was it a mechanical failure? Had the cables snapped? Was there anything we could do to stop it? But there was no time to think. The elevator was moving too fast, and the grinding noise was getting louder, more ominous. The walls of the cabin seemed to close in around me, the air growing thick and suffocating. My hands were trembling, and I could feel a cold sweat forming on my forehead. Then, without warning, the elevator jolted to a violent stop. The force of it was enough to knock us all off our feet, sending us crashing to the floor in a tangled heap of limbs and bodies. I felt the impact reverberate through my entire body, a sharp pain shooting up my spine as I hit the floor hard. Someone screamed, a high-pitched, terrified sound that echoed through the small space. For a moment, everything was still. The elevator had stopped moving, but the lights were flickering madly, casting strange, disorienting shadows on the walls. The grinding noise had ceased, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow even more unsettling. I struggled to push myself up, my body aching from the fall. Around me, the others were doing the same, their faces pale and drawn with fear. No one spoke. No one knew what to say. I glanced at the floor indicator above the door, but the numbers were blank, the display completely dark. We had no idea where we were, how far we had fallen, or if the elevator was stable. The only thing we knew for certain was that we were trapped, suspended in the middle of the shaft with no way out. The panic was palpable, a heavy, suffocating presence that filled the air. I could feel it tightening in my chest, making it hard to breathe. My mind was racing, trying to think of what to do next, but the fear was overwhelming, clouding my thoughts. "Is everyone okay?" I heard someone ask, their voice shaky and uncertain. There were murmurs of assent, a few nods, but no one seemed convinced. We were all in shock, struggling to process what had just happened. "We need to get out of here," another voice said, more forcefully this time. "We need to call for help." Someone reached for the emergency phone on the wall, but it was dead, no dial tone, no connection. The realization hit us like a punch to the gut. We were cut off, completely isolated from the outside world. That's when the real fear set in. The seconds dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity as we huddled together in that cramped, darkened space. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made your skin crawl and your heart race. I could hear the others breathing heavily, their breaths coming in short, shallow gasps as the reality of our situation began to sink in. We were trapped in an elevator, suspended who knew how many feet above the ground, with no way to call for help and no idea how long we'd be stuck there. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a gnawing dread that seemed to grow with every passing moment. Someone tried pressing the buttons for different floors, but nothing happened. The panel was completely unresponsive, as if the entire system had shorted out. The emergency lights were still flickering, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls, but the main lights had gone out entirely, leaving us in a dim, almost surreal twilight. The grinding noise that had accompanied our descent had stopped, but it was still echoing in my ears, a phantom sound that I couldn't shake. I kept waiting for it to start up again, for the elevator to lurch back into motion, but it remained eerily still. In the dim light, I could see the fear etched on everyone's faces. One woman was clutching her purse to her chest, her knuckles white as she stared at the door, as if willing it to open. A man in a suit was muttering to himself, his eyes darting around the cabin, searching for some kind of escape. A younger guy, probably an intern or a junior employee, was hunched over in the corner, his hands covering his face as he tried to hold back tears. And then there was me, standing there in the middle of it all, trying to keep my own fear in check. I wasn't the type to panic easily. I prided myself on being calm under pressure, the kind of guy who could handle whatever life threw at him. But this was different. This was something I'd never experienced before, something that went beyond the usual stresses of work or life. This was pure, unadulterated fear, the kind that grips you by the throat and doesn't let go. I tried to think rationally, to come up with a plan, but my mind was spinning, too overwhelmed by the situation. The idea of being stuck in that elevator for hours, maybe even longer, was terrifying. The thought of what might happen if the cables snapped, if the elevator plummeted to the bottom of the shaft, was even worse. And then there was the unknown, the possibility that something else was at play, something we couldn't see or understand. The flickering lights, the grinding noise, the way the elevator had sped up before stopping so suddenly. It all felt wrong, like we were caught in some kind of twisted nightmare. I wasn't the only one feeling it. I could see it in the others, the way they kept glancing around, their eyes wide with fear. We were all thinking the same thing, even if no one wanted to say it out loud. What if we never got out of here? We must have been trapped in that elevator for what felt like hours, though it was hard to tell time in the dim, flickering light. The panic among us ebbed and flowed like a tide, moments of frantic desperation followed by long stretches of eerie silence. Every so often, someone would try the buttons again or bang on the door, hoping to attract attention from the outside. But it was always the same, nothing happened. The atmosphere was suffocating, a heavy weight pressing down on us as we waited, powerless to change our situation. The air grew stale, and the temperature seemed to rise, adding to our discomfort. Sweat trickled down my back, but I barely noticed it, too focused on the gnawing fear that gnawed at my insides. At some point we started talking, tentative, uneasy conversations that mostly revolved around what might have caused the malfunction. We shared theories, trying to piece together the sequence of events that had led us to this point. Electrical failure? Mechanical issue? Sabotage? Each suggestion was met with nods or murmurs of agreement, but none of us really knew. The conversations didn't last long. The fear was too pervasive, too overwhelming. It clung to us like a second skin, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. I found myself retreating into my own thoughts, trying to block out the oppressive reality of our situation. And that's when it happened. It started with a faint noise, barely audible over the sound of our breathing. A low, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the walls of the elevator shaft. At first I thought I was imagining it, a product of my frazzled nerves and overactive imagination. But then it grew louder, more distinct, until it was impossible to ignore. I wasn't the only one who heard it. The others fell silent, their eyes widening as they strained to listen. The hum grew into a drone, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through the very metal of the elevator. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, a sound that seemed to defy explanation. And then, without warning, the lights went out completely. The sudden plunge into darkness was disorienting, a shock to the system that sent a jolt of terror through my body. I heard someone gasp, another person curse under their breath. My own heart was racing, my pulse pounding in my ears as I tried to make sense of what was happening. We were plunged into total darkness, unable to see even an inch in front of our faces. The hum was still there, louder now, more insistent, as if it were coming from all around us, closing in. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. And then in the darkness I heard it, a voice, low, almost a whisper, but unmistakably there. It was impossible to tell where it was coming from, but it was close, too close. Help me. The words sent a chill down my spine, freezing me in place. The voice was faint, barely more than a murmur, but it was filled with a desperation that was palpable. It was the voice of someone trapped, someone who had been left behind, someone who was suffering. Please, help me. The voice came again, closer this time, more insistent. I wanted to respond, to call out, to ask who was there, but the words wouldn't come. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move, unable to speak. The others must have heard it too. I could sense their tension, feel the fear radiating off them in waves. No one spoke. No one dared to acknowledge what we were hearing. The voice continued, growing louder, more desperate. It was no longer a whisper. It was a cry, a plea for help that echoed through the darkness, bouncing off the walls of the elevator. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, surrounding us, suffocating us. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, a void that seemed to swallow up all sound. The darkness was complete, a blackness so absolute that it felt like a physical presence, pressing in on me from all sides. I don't know how long we stayed like that, frozen in place, listening to the silence. It could have been minutes or hours. I had lost all sense of time. But eventually the lights flickered back on, weak and sputtering, casting a dim, sickly glow over the cabin. We were still in the elevator, still trapped, but something had changed. The hum was gone, the voice silenced, but the atmosphere was different, charged, electric, filled with a tension that crackled in the air. And then, as if on cue, the elevator doors slid open. We were on the ground floor. The lobby stretched out before us, empty and quiet, the late evening sunlight streaming through the glass doors. No one moved. We were all too stunned, too disoriented to react. It took a moment for the realization to sink in, that we were free, that we could step out of that metal box and leave this nightmare behind. But as I took my first step out of the elevator, I felt a deep, unsettling sense of unease. Something was wrong, terribly, inexplicably wrong. I glanced back at the others, and I could see the same expression on their faces: confusion, fear, a gnawing sense that this wasn't over. The lobby was empty, eerily quiet, as if the entire building had been abandoned. There was no one at the front desk, no security guards, no cleaning staff. The only sound was the soft hum of the building's ventilation system, a low, constant drone that filled the silence. We stepped out of the elevator one by one, hesitantly, as if expecting something to happen. But nothing did. The doors slid shut behind us with a soft, final click, and the elevator returned to its normal, nondescript appearance. But I knew that something had happened in that elevator, something that defied explanation, something that had left its mark on all of us. We exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke. There was nothing to say, nothing that could make sense of what we had just experienced. I left the building in a daze, my mind racing, my heart still pounding in my chest. The city streets were busy with the usual Friday evening crowds, people going about their lives, completely oblivious to what had just happened in that office tower. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just stepped out of a nightmare, that the world had shifted in some fundamental way. The memory of that voice, that desperate plea for help, echoed in my mind, refusing to fade. I never spoke about what happened in that elevator, not to my coworkers, not to anyone. I buried the memory deep, convincing myself that it was just a strange malfunction, a trick of the mind. But deep down, I knew better. Something had happened in that elevator, something that would stay with me for the rest of my life. And even now, years later, whenever I step into an elevator, I can't help but feel a twinge of fear, a fleeting sense of dread that I can't quite explain. The memory of that night still haunts me, a reminder of the thin line between the ordinary and the unknown, between safety and terror. And I know that no matter how much time passes, I will never forget the fear I felt in that elevator, the suffocating darkness, the voice that called out to me from the shadows. Because some things once experienced can never be forgotten.